Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Philip Ball. He's a freelance science writer. He's the author of many popular books on science, and today we're focusing on the Book of Minds, how to understand ourselves and other beings, from animals to AI to aliens. So, Dr. Ball, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you on.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking me, Ricardo.
Okay, so I would like to start with this question. Since we're talking about minds, I mean, it's a concept that, as we'll go through the questions, we'll see that it applies or probably applies to many different kinds of beings. But I guess that one of the ideas that I got from your book and the work of other people, by the way, is that we as humans have this sort of sometimes contradictory beliefs about attributing minds, particularly to other beings, animals, and so on. Sometimes we think that they don't have minds. Sometimes we probably anthropomorphize them a little bit too much. So, to start off with, what is the solipsist position? And do you think that there's any definite way of refuting it?
I guess, I mean, I'm not a philosopher, so I won't give the rigorous philosopher's point of view about that. But the way I understand it is that one can take the position that everything we experience is, it comes in sort of from the outside to us. It ultimately, it's all about us. That's how we know that anything is out there, how we can think we know that there is anything out there. And so ultimately, one could say, we can't know for sure actually what is out there or whether there is anything out there. All we can know is our own experience. And so the solipsist position says, we can't get beyond that. We can't know for sure whether what we're actually experiencing is being fed to us by some alien intelligence. Or if we go back to Descartes, René Descartes floated this idea that maybe there's a demon that is out there, deceiving us with these sensations that the demon is feeding to us. And that actually, there's nothing more than that. That's something, and there's a modern day version of this which says maybe we're in a computer simulation and that's all we are, and everything is just illusory and it's just a sort of computer construction created by an alien intelligence. I think the problem with that position is that I don't see how it can be refuted, and I don't see that it is a useful position to take. I think it can be an interesting question to ask, particularly from that idea of the simulation hypothesis. It's quite interesting to think, well, is there some way we could test that idea? Is there some sort of matrix-like flaw in the system we can look for that could refute this idea? But I don't think anyone has come up with convincing arguments about that. And I think the problem really with the solipsist position is you can't get beyond it. You can't do anything useful with it. So I think rather than refuting it, I think it's more effective, more useful, and more productive to say, well, let's assume that isn't the case, because otherwise we're just at an intellectual dead end. Let's assume there really is some kind of real world out there that we're interacting with in some way, and then we can ask useful questions about that interaction rather than just assume.
Since we're talking about minds, what is a mind exactly? And is it necessary or strictly necessary for us to have a proper definition of mind to really explore, study, and understand how the minds, our own minds and the minds of other beings work?
Well, my own view is that it's actually probably important at this stage, at least, not to try to create a rigorous definition of what is a mind and what isn't. And what I wanted to try to do with the book was to open up that discussion rather than trying to categorize everything into beings that have minds and beings that don't. I wanted to talk about mindedness, degrees of possessing some kind of mind, but also to explore the idea that it's not a binary thing and it's not a single valued thing either, that we have degrees of this thing called mindedness, that actually there are many dimensions to what we might want to think about as a mind. And we can more productively explore the idea of whether different entities have minds or not by taking that point of view, by thinking about what are the elements that make up a mind and thinking about the degrees to which different entities have those different elements. So I'm more keen to talk about a notion of mindedness and a multidimensional notion. Having said that, I do start the book with a kind of a loose definition of mind that I want to just put forward as a working definition, as something to, go forward with and to explore with. And the definition I give is that in order for us to think about something as having a mind, there needs to be something it is like to be that entity. So, I don't think there is anything it is like to be my coffee cup. I may be wrong. Some people think, that there are degrees of mindedness in all of matter. But my own view is that I don't see that there's much we can do with the notion that perhaps my coffee cup has a mind. So I think, that there's nothing it is like to be a coffee cup. Is there something it is like to be a bacterium, to be a fungus, to be a tree? There, I think that we can have a useful discussion about that. And certainly when we come to, mammals, other vertebrates, and certainly other primates as well as us, then absolutely, I think there is something it is like to be those entities. And then we can start to explore what it might be to be like those entities. So that's my loose definition, but I certainly don't want to impose it as a rigorous definition of mind.
Well, I'm not sure about the coffee mug, but I guess that the panpsychists might get mad at you for.
Absolutely, and I think it's nice to have that discussion. So panpsychism is this idea that there is a degree of mindedness in all matter, that it's inherent in matter and manifests, to different degrees, depending perhaps on how it's constructed. And there are various, nuances to that argument. So, it's interesting to me that what would have seemed, I think, probably 20, 30 years ago to be a ridiculous position has come back into fashion, has come back into the discussion. And I think, I'm sure we'll get into this later on in terms of how far we can push this idea of mind. I think it's absolutely valid to have that discussion. For myself, I don't find it a useful idea to think that mindedness is something somehow inherent in matter. I don't even know what that might mean, but I'm very happy to see that added to the discussion.
But when studying minds, do you think that we should start from any particular kind of assumption? That is, for example, starting from the assumption that another being should have a mind or that it shouldn't have one? I mean, is it useful to start from any particular assumption, or should we start from, let's say, a blank slatist kind of approach? Not a blank slatist kind of approach to the mind, but just trying to not have any assumptions about beings having minds or not.
I think it's very difficult to start without assumptions, even subconsciously. And I think that what has tended to happen in the past, if you look at the literature on the philosophy of mind, it's all about us. So it isn't even in some of the great books, in the philosophy of mind, they have fantastic ideas, but the underlying assumption is we all know what a mind is. It's what we have. It's what we're like. And I think that's been the problem in the past. There's been this tremendous anthropocentrism about the way we think about minds. And what I really wanted to try to do with my book is to get away from that, is to somehow think about how to situate the kinds of minds that we have within a broader notion of what mindedness can be. So, I think if we're able to start from there, we can have a richer discussion, and it doesn't need to begin with the assumption that other entities of any sort have minds or not. I think that, and again, I'm sure we'll get onto this later on, that the discussion that is going on around AI at the moment gives a very useful perspective on that anthropocentrism, that I think there's a strong tendency to imagine that if we think an AI has mind, or if we think that AIs are now developing minds, the assumption is they're going to be to some degree like ours. And probably the more complex the AI gets, the more it will be a mind like ours. And I want to get rid of that underlying assumption, I think there is absolutely no reason to think that that will be the case.
Could you tell us about this idea that you present in your book about the space of possible minds? I think that it is a very interesting one because it points to the suggestion, I think, that there's really not just one sort of mind, but there are perhaps different kinds of minds out there, right?
Yeah, this is the framework that I try to use in the book to think about the kinds of minds that might exist. And I really want to emphasize it's not my idea. It came from, it was first proposed, to my knowledge at least, first proposed in 1984 by a computer scientist named Aaron Sloman at the University of Birmingham here in the UK. And I have to say, this coming across this idea was really the catalyst for me being able to write this book. It began several years back. The notion ultimately of this book began several years back when I was asked by a magazine, science magazine, to explore a paper that was trying to look at this question of AI and at the fact that a lot of AI works as a black box, and how do you open that black box and find out how it's thinking, if you like, whether we can really call it thinking or not, is another question. And I asked a few people in AI about this paper and tried to get somewhere with it, and I really wasn't getting anywhere. And somehow or another, in AI, Murray Shanahan at the university at Imperial College in London here, and Murray he's a very busy man. I couldn't speak to him at length, but he said, "Oh, have a look at this paper by Aaron Sloman," and he pointed me in that direction. And the paper was called, I think, just The Space of Possible Minds. And this notion he had that let's think about it as this multidimensional space in which there are different attributes of mind, and the entities that we think of as having minds or might think of, like other animals, are somewhere in this space, are points in this space, and so are we. We're a point in this space. And this was a very nice way of relativizing minds and thinking comparatively about them without, as I say, without having to get into the argument about what is a mind and does this thing have a mind and does this thing not, and so on. So that framework really got me sort of thinking about how I could think more broadly, not just about AI, but about all sorts of entities, and think about the kinds of minds that they might have. So that sort of stuck with me. This was years back, actually, several years back, and this sort of stuck with me. And I didn't know what to do about this idea. I never wrote the article. And then I spent the summer of 2019 as a visitor at the Department of Systems Biology at Harvard University, Harvard Medical School, in fact. And so I was living for 3 months in the Boston area, and that is an absolute hive of activity about these sorts of areas where you've got cognitive scientists, you've got computer scientists, you've got brain scientists, you've got people looking at child behavior, all speaking to each other. It's such a fascinating sort of nexus, really, of different disciplines. So it was an ideal place to be. And within days, actually, of landing in Boston and sort of embedding myself there, I suddenly realized this is what I need to do. It's not an article. That's why I haven't written this article. It's a book, and I really need to start talking to people, here all around me about these ideas. And that was how the book came to be. So it was really Aaron's idea of the space of possible minds that allowed me to see how to frame it.
And I guess that a very important question also to address here is, how do you look at the relationship between the mind and the brain? Because I guess that by answering this question, it opens up several other different questions and several other different avenues to explore, because then we might get into questions about, do beings who lack brains or even nervous systems altogether, can they have minds themselves? And then other questions that we might explore here. But then how do you look at the relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm just trying to see whether on my shelves, I think I probably moved it away, sadly. There was one of the books. There it is. So one of the books I encountered, it was just in the local library at Boston very quickly. It was on the for sale shelves. So I got it for $1, and it's The Biological Mind by Alan Jasanoff. And I did realize that Alan he's a neuroscientist. He's actually at MIT. He was just up the road from me. So I read this book, and it was fantastically useful. It's saying how brain, body, and environment collaborate to make us who we are. And Alan's position is very much that, you know, the brain is an organ of the body. And we have to think about it in that context. It's obviously a very powerful organ. It does, you know, phenomenal things, remarkable things that we don't fully understand. But it is a physical organ of the body. It's often I went to talk to Alan, and it was fantastically useful to do that, of course. And you know, we often hear this sort of metaphor that the brain is the hardware or the wetware, really, of the mind, and the mind is somehow the software. Yeah. I'm wary of that analogy because I'm wary of computational analogies generally for our own cognition. But I certainly think it's important to see the brain as, you know, it really is this physical thing that, you know, obviously it's a network of interconnected neurons. There are other cells in there that have a role in cognition, things like glial cells that, you know, aren't neurons, aren't firing, but they have a role in maintaining the brain and in cognition. So, you know, we can talk about that as an organic process, literally a process of an organ. And out of that somehow comes this more abstract notion of mind. But the brain is plugged into the rest of the body. It's plugged into our sensory apparatus. And that is an aspect of what creates mind. So, you know, mind is a more abstract thing. And I don't think there's a one-to-one mapping between the notion of mind and what goes on in the brain. Clearly, they're extremely closely connected, and we need to understand what goes into the brain to sort of understand our own minds. But I don't think it's this sort of simple mapping. I think the mind is a broader concept, a broader entity that is really about our existence as organisms in a particular environment with a particular evolutionary history. So I think we have to think about an evolutionary angle to the mind and also an environmental angle to the mind. So yeah, I want to kind of complicate that idea, and not just for us to imagine that somehow the mind is something that exists within our, you know, organic brains. Mm-hmm.
So I guess that you are fond of perspectives coming from embodied cognition and perhaps beyond that for cognition. I mean, looking at the mind, not just not just about being about the brain, but also the rest of the body and the environment around us, the social environment, and so on.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's very clear for our own minds that the way that our cognition, the way we experience the world, absolutely always does take into account the fact that we are embodied and that we have particular kinds of bodies. So, for example, the way we experience the world is predicated on the experiential notion, we just learned this, that actually when we see something, we kind of know that if we move our body to the other side, we're going to see it from a different angle. We imagine, you know, that there's something there for us to see. So we can move around our environment and experience it in these ways. And the way we understand our environment, the way our mind interprets our sensory data, is predicated on the kinds of bodies we have and the kinds of things we do. So I think, for example, that the mind of a bird, you know, that's predicated in some way that we certainly can't intuit, and it's going to be hard to understand. But in some way, it's predicated on the idea that it can fly, that it can see the world in ways that we can't experience. So our actual, you know, the way that our bodies work, the way that we are embodied within our environment, is central to the way our mind interprets the world. So I absolutely think that this notion of an embodied mind is central to understanding our own. And I think that again is a discussion that is becoming very prevalent in AI, where, you know, at the moment AI systems on the whole aren't embodied. I mean, we're starting to, use AI and robotics together. And I think that it's going to be very interesting then to think about the kinds of, let's call them cognitive modes that AI might develop if it's in a robotic embodiment that is very different from ours, that maybe is reconfigurable or something in a way that we're not. And I think this is also true for thinking about the minds of other animals. We have to take into account what kind of physical embodiment they have.
Among AI researchers, there's even people suggesting that perhaps one of the reasons why AI systems might never develop minds is that they are not embodied, if they are not embodied, of course, and also much less human-like minds because they won't have a body like ours.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, the one response to that is, well, it's not difficult in principle to give AI some kind of embodiment. We can, as I say, we're already doing that with some robotics. We can give it sensory inputs of some sort, including sensory inputs that we don't have, sensitivity to UV or to X-rays or something. And we can give it some capacity to move around and so on. So, I don't think that in itself is a sort of, game stopper for giving AI a mind. But I think that it's certainly part of the discussion at the moment that when we're talking about the AI systems that we have that don't have that sort of embodiment, can they really conceptualize the physical world in the way that we can, if they can't experience it and move around it in the ways that we can? And I think that's an excellent question. I think that AI will be limited, unless it has some kind of embodiment. But I think that there may be ways to embody AI, and the same question is asked about brains. There's this long-standing philosophical notion of a brain in a vat, a brain that is just, literally that is just kind of kept alive in this, culture medium or something, nutrient medium. Can it, if it's a human brain, does it have the same kind of cognition that we have? It's physically the same sort of object, but if it doesn't have a body, if it doesn't experience the world in the way that we do, then what kind of cognition will it have? And what's interesting there is that now that's becoming a reality, not least because we are able to grow these things that some people call mini brains. They're brain organoids, which are grown from human tissue. They're tiny little things. And they seem to, certainly they're active, they're neurologically active. Is there some sort of consciousness in there? And if so, if it doesn't have a body, what can that be like? So this, what used to be a philosophical question about the brain in a vat, is now becoming an absolutely real physical question that we have to confront, because there are ethical and moral dimensions to that question.
So let's just focus on humans for a little bit and approach things from an evolutionary perspective here. So one of the things about our minds that we value the most is, of course, our intelligence. But there are several different hypotheses out there as to how our intellectual capacities might have evolved. And there are things related to social ability, tool use, sexual selection. And it might also be a product of cultural evolution, actually. So what do you make of these hypotheses?
Yeah, so there is this big question of how it has come to be that we... So, I mean, I want to get away from human uniqueness in some ways, but I think it's really important not to deny the aspects in which we do seem to be unique in the biological world. And one of those is the richness, the diversity of our cognition that gives us things like culture, and particularly things like language, that we don't really find anywhere else in the animal kingdom. We can find things that seem related to that, but no other creature has language like we do, or the sort of culture that we do. So the question is, what makes us special in that particular regard? And again, the answer is that we don't really know, but there are these interesting hypotheses about them. And one of them is this idea that our minds are particularly attuned to our social environment, so that we evolved in groups that had to get along, that had to be able to collaborate in some way. Now, we're not unique in that regard, but perhaps we were unique in the extent to which that was crucial to our survival. And so we have minds, and this is often what psychologists call a theory of mind, which doesn't mean a theory of how the mind works. It means that we each have this notion that other entities, other humans, have their own point of view, have their own knowledge that we don't have access to, have their own perspectives and their own motivations and desires that won't necessarily be the same as ours. This is really, there are now some good arguments for why some other primates, at least chimpanzees and orangutans and others, do have something like a theory of mind. But that's an ongoing discussion. Clearly, we have something like this, and we can see it appear in infants, really around between the ages of 2 and 4 or 5. That we start to see infants behave in a way that makes it clear that they understand. They know things that others don't know. They don't just project their mind onto the whole of the world, if you like. So this is an aspect of human cognition that is about social intelligence, and we become, on the whole, very attuned to picking up social cues from very subtle things from other people's behaviour. So one idea is that this is because this had an adaptive advantage in our evolution, that we develop these social minds. One of the big questions about human cognition is why we have so much of it. And that's not a boast, that's simply a fact that, why is, if we want to explain our minds in an adaptive perspective, as an evolutionary adaptation, it's very hard, I think, to give an explanation for why, in that case, we were able to come up with the theory of relativity, for example. What use is that? Or, people discuss the value of our artistic creativity. What use is music, really? But music seems to be crucial to every culture we know. It seems to exist in every culture, even though written language doesn't in every culture. So, what is that about? Why do we have this cognitive excess, it seems? And we don't really know. But the argument about sexual selection is that maybe it's a bit like the peacock's tail, that there was something about having a kind of, superior cognition, if you like, in some sense, that meant you were more likely to get a partner. And so, the mind just kind of, like the peacock's tail, became this ridiculously, extravagant thing that it really doesn't need, but it serves as a signal for sexual, for attracting a partner. Perhaps minds are like that as well, that they expanded out of all proportion to what we really needed for sexual selection. Maybe it's very hard to figure out ways of testing these ideas. And then the cultural idea is that, rather than trying to think about the mind strictly in terms of our kind of organic endowment, maybe we have now reached the point where culture is more important, if you like, than biology. So we inherit things culturally. We inherit literature, language culturally. We're not born with the ability to speak our native tongue. We have to learn it, and that is passed on, and that is taught to us. And we inherit this wealth of intellectual riches from people who've come before us, and of artistic riches that is not biologically inherited. So maybe culture has become the main driver of our minds. There are these various ideas about why it is that we have this sort of cognitive excess, but we don't really understand why that is.
But since we're talking here about evolutionary perspectives on the human mind, what do you make of the suggestion or assumption that some people bring to the table, that we have evolved minds with a particular set of information processing mechanisms that have not changed much, if at all, since basically the Stone Age, or perhaps supposing that everything the mind does is ultimately geared toward Darwinian fitness. Do you think that that's perhaps a very, I don't know, reductionist proposition, or?
Yeah, I think it can be. Yes. And I think for one thing, I think that trying to understand all the capabilities of the mind in terms of what is their adaptive value doesn't really get to the bottom of what a mind is about. So, for example, there is clearly a genetic influence on our minds, and on our behavior. So, you can find just about every aspect of human behavior that we know of, you can find some correlation with genetic variation. So that can lead some people to suppose that, well, ultimately then it's all minds, what the human mind at least is about. And I think what minds within the living world generally is about is, in some sense, to get beyond that, to get beyond genetic programming. So what one alternative to actually having minds is to make us entirely genetically programmed, so that that we get a stimulus and it creates some response in our cells that switches on some genes, and we give a certain behavior in a completely sort of like pushing a button in a completely deterministic way. And we see behavior that is more like that in bacteria. Even bacteria, I think, are more complex than that, but we can certainly see, oh, okay, this stimulus triggers this genetic, pathway, and so on. But ultimately, at some point, as we develop, as we become more complex entities, as we have more complexity of experience, as we, have more complex environments, and particularly as we have more complex social environments, that sort of approach isn't going to work, because, if you like, our genes can't anticipate everything that we will experience and give us an appropriate response to all that diversity. And so a better evolutionary answer is to give us a mind, to put it very anthropomorphically, that a mind is something that is adaptive, that isn't there isn't a prescribed way for a mind to respond. And in fact, we see this even in organisms much simpler than us, that a given environmental stimulus won't necessarily always elicit the same response. It all depends on context. It depends on what that mind or what that entity has experienced previously. So there's a more sort of complex processing going on that gives rise to behavior. That's really what minds do. And that's a more, from an evolutionary perspective, that is a more effective response, because it allows you to be innovative, to find some response to things that you and your ancestors have never experienced before. And of course, increasingly, we are having to do that all the time in our own environment. And, in order not to just be completely sort of flawed by that and, have no idea what to do, that's what minds are for. They give us, humans at least, rules of thumb that are usually good enough. We can usually decide on what to do. It may or may not be a good decision, but it must be on the whole good enough, because we survive, right, for our natural lifespan, mostly. So that is what minds are for. Therefore, getting beyond that sort of push button sort of evolutionary pre-programmed response. So I think that is the perspective we need for thinking about the fact that evolution is slow. Our minds, in some sense, are not probably very different from the minds of our ancestors 10,000, 20,000 years ago. But the nature of minds means that doesn't mean that and clearly it doesn't mean that we will be responding to what we experience now in the way that those ancestors will have done, partly because we have also this cultural inheritance that gears us to modernity as it is today. So that frees us from those responses. That gives us more apparatus to deal with the complexity of the modern world, and that is precisely what minds are designed to do, to be able to use experience of all kinds of sorts to frame a response, rather than responding in some knee-jerk, pre-programmed way that is, evolutionarily rooted in the Stone Age.
And just a few minutes ago, we mentioned, for example, cultural evolution, and I guess that it is safe to say at this point that there's very compelling evidence out there coming from the work of cultural evolutionary theorists that suggests that at least some of our information processing mechanisms can be altered, at least to some extent, by being exposed to different kinds of cultures, at least over time. Right.
Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely clear. It's been clear for a very long time that to a considerable degree, our instinctive, as it feels like at least, our instinctive responses to a given situation have a very strong cultural element. They're not, so in a sense, our minds as a species don't, our biological minds, our innate kind of the organic makeup of our minds doesn't differ significantly across the world, and yet our behaviors clearly do. So a huge amount of that is culturally determined. So yeah, I think that's vitally an important thing to recognise, and again is absolutely what minds are there to do, to be able to have that flexibility and adaptability and the capacity to learn from experience of all sort, including the things that we are taught, the things that our particular cultures give us, in order to find an appropriate response within our particular environment.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that at least we in the Western in the sort of Western intellectual tradition do is that we tend to separate reason from emotion. But does that make sense, cognitively speaking? I mean, is there really one thing in our mind that is reason, and then we have emotions, and they might be in conflict with one another, and if we just got rid of our emotions, we would be perfectly rational? I mean, does that idea make sense at all?
I don't think it does make sense, no, because I think it's a false division of what mind is. There's a big discussion, an ongoing discussion about what emotion is and what role emotion plays in cognition. But I think the one thing that's become very clear is that it does play a role, that it's not something that clouds. I mean, it can cloud our judgment, clearly, but it's not inherently something that gets in the way of judgment. Actually, it would be very hard to think appropriately, to behave appropriately, if we didn't have emotion. And we see that actually, in people who have different kinds of minds, where perhaps in one way or another, emotion is less salient or is salient in different ways. And sometimes people like that can struggle in the kind of society we have that, makes assumptions about how we will behave based on, what seems to be more neurotypical. It seems clear that emotion is a central part of cognition in some way. Now, there are various ideas about what roles emotion is playing. I mean, one is that in some ways emotions can be a sort of cognitive tiebreaker. If we tried to compute our behavior, in every circumstance, to compute the best thing to do. For one thing, we'd probably never do anything because it would take too long. And for another thing, in most situations, I think that we experience in life, it's not as though there is a right response, a single right answer that somehow we can reach. So in order to free us from that sort of, what might be a sort of freezing of behavior because we can't actually find the right answer, it takes too long, emotions kick in and we go with our gut response. some, for better or worse sometimes, but at least we do something rather than being locked into this, sort of attempt to intellectually figure out what we are supposed to do. And it seems clear that sometimes sometimes emotion, is an aid to making good decisions. That it's that perhaps it's part of what of these kinds of rules of thumb that we rely on, that draw on our experience, and perhaps draw on something to do with our innate kind of wiring, in order to reach an appropriate decision. So we make a lot of social decisions, and a lot of our social interactions are informed by our emotional responses in ways that make us empathetic. For example, clearly empathy it relies on having that emotionality. There's also an argument that in some sense, perhaps emotions are telling us about the body, telling us about the bodily side of our experience, that they are, sometimes we just, we might feel that something is the wrong thing to do. And then we might, for example, think, oh, well, actually, now I realize that I was ill. I wasn't feeling very well. And that's why I really didn't want to go to that party. That maybe, that emotional response is some kind of, and clearly an emotional response, relies on certain, a part of that is to do with neurotransmitters in our brain. So there is a physical and chemical, biochemical, biological aspect to that emotion that is triggered by processes, physical, chemical processes going on in the body. So there is that feedback, with the body, and maybe emotions are part of that. But yeah, in one way or another, emotions are clearly a part of what we think of as our reasoning. And I think it's important to remember that that's not a new idea, really. That was, you can certainly find that idea expressed. I don't remember the wording he used, but David Hume, the Enlightenment philosopher, essentially said that same thing, that emotions are our reason is ultimately a sort of emotional one.
Mm-hmm. So at a certain point there you touched briefly on the idea of neurodiversity, and I actually had a question here about that. So do you think that the minds of neurodivergent people should be thought of as different kinds of human minds in the space of possible minds? I mean, we talked about the idea that there's not one single kind of mind out there, but even within the, let's say, subspace of human minds, I mean, are there different kinds of human minds, or should we think that there are different kinds of human minds?
Yeah, I think this was one of the most helpful, I think, one of the most helpful notions to emerge from this way of thinking about minds as a space of possible minds, that, crudely speaking, you can place, if we knew what this space was, we might say, well, chimpanzees are here, and, European robins are here, and humans are here in this data point. But actually, each of those data points, and particularly, perhaps it's particularly useful to think about that for humans, it's a cloud of points. That we all have different degrees of these dimensions of mindedness, whatever they are, of some kind of purely sort of cognitive intelligence, if you like, or whatever that might mean, or emotionality or whatever. So we are a cloud of points within that space. And that is the natural thing to expect from, just from the diversity of the biological world. But there's also an argument that is now being made, and I think that in essence, I think it's a very convincing argument that we know that biological variability for populations is crucial to the health of that population, and I think that neurological or cognitive diversity for human populations is also essential. I mean, this is what I think we probably all feel instinctively, that of course it would be pretty awful if everyone thought in exactly the same way. There would be, we depend on there being people who have ideas that we don't, and see things in the way that we don't, and have kinds of creativity that others don't. this is what makes human experience rich, but it's also what makes human populations viable in the first place. And the argument has been made, particularly by the cognitive scientist Simon Baron-Cohen, that we need to think about neurodiversity this way, that there are aspects of people who we might think of as neurodiverse that have been essential to our evolution as a species. That we need people who will obsessively, if you like, think about a particular idea until they crack that problem. And I guess it feels when we think about, we talk about neurodiversity now, and I think that's much better than thinking that there is a kind of an ideal and then there are deviations from that. That has been the sort of model in the past. This is how humans are kind of meant to be, if you like, and then there are people who are sort of aberrations from that. And I think that's a very unhelpful way of thinking about it. I think this idea of there just being a cloud of, that describes human cognition in that space, and that it is diverse and that it's necessarily diverse, it's not only a more accurate way of thinking about it, but I think it helps us to really appreciate the value of that diversity for our cultures and our societies.
So right at the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned the fact that we tend to have some contradictory views of how we attribute minds to other beings. Sometimes it seems that we attribute minds to other beings too easily, and other times not as easily. So, but what are your own thoughts on it? Do you think that we tend to attribute minds to other beings too easily, or that perhaps we are too resistant to doing that?
I think both are true, and I think that there are I think there are kind of historical reasons for that. I think that intrinsically, because we, for whatever reason, have these very socially adapted minds, this tendency to attribute theory of mind, to other people, that is, if you like, that is over adapted. So we do that, instinctively far too readily. We attribute minds all over the place, and in the historical past, we have, we assume that when the weather is bad, the gods are angry. We put mind out there. We see faces in things where faces don't exist, and we see minds in places where probably minds don't exist. So that is our innate tendency, probably for good evolutionary reasons. I think that sometimes the pendulum has then swung too far the other way in doing research. Understandably, that in order to counteract that unhelpful tendency to attribute minds too much, we attribute them too little. And certainly in a lot of behavioral science in the mid and early 20th century, there was this complete reaction to that idea, and to really think of other species as machine-like, as programmed, as not having minds. I mean, this is something that actually also goes back to Descartes, that he had this idea that only humans, there it is more religiously motivated, but that only humans really have minds, and that animals are much more like automata. They don't have souls, if you like, sort of guiding the mind. They are just like automata. This was, I think it was probably a necessary reaction in order to not anthropomorphize other species, but it went too far, and it led to a real resistance to the idea of attributing kinds of mindedness where in fact we should have been. And I think that there comes a point, if we're trying to understand certainly a complex creature like other primates, there comes a point where, in order to resist the idea that they are responding in ways that are analogous to the way we respond in a minded way, we are forced to make very convoluted explanations. So why did there was an example I talked about in the book of I think it was a gorilla who rescued a child who, and I think rescued is the right word, who fell into the cage, the gorilla enclosure in a zoo, and the gorilla picked up the child and kind of seemingly held it like it would its own child, and then carried it to the to a place where the child could be picked up. And some people wanted to say, well, it's probably, there's probably just an automated evolutionary response to this. It probably confused the child with its own child, in a way that was just sort of pre-programmed and, instinctive. Whereas, the truth is it looked nothing like the gorilla's own child. The gorilla is perfectly capable of distinguishing that, that it actually is a more economical hypothesis to think in some sense, the gorilla probably has empathy for this. It understands there's this other being, that it's a being that, doesn't have the capacity to help itself or has been injured. And so it responds empathically, and that there's it's meaningful to say that. That's actually a more economical hypothesis, and it also makes more evolutionary sense because of course their minds share a lot of attributes with ours. We're relatively recent evolutionary relatives. So I think that there does come a point where it absolutely makes not just makes kind of logical sense, but makes biological sense, really, an evolutionary sense, to attribute attributes of our own mind to other organisms. So it's finding the right balance there. Not doing that too much, but being prepared to do that to some extent. And again, I think this idea of a space of possible minds helps to do that, because it helps us to think about that problem in ways that don't insist that we are then just projecting our own mind, thinking that creature is in the same bit of mind space as we are. We can think of it as being elsewhere, but as having some attributes of mindedness.
And do you think that, scientifically speaking, it is possible for us to understand the subjective experiences of other beings, like other non-human animals, for example? Or is it that we can only study their behavior, their cognitive mechanisms, how they process information, but it's not really possible scientifically for us to understand what it is like to be another animal, for example?
Well, of course, we can't even understand what it is like to be another person. we can have good guesses about that, and they're probably reasonable guesses because we are, we're the same species. But there are limits to how far we can go with that. We are necessarily trapped, each of us, within our own minds, and that makes it sound like a terrible thing, but it's simply the matter of existence. That is the nature of the sort of beings we are. So that said, I think it's very hard to see how we could ever, if you like, break out of our own minds in that subjective way and understand the subjective experience of other minds. This, of course, comes back to the famous article by the philosopher Thomas Nagel that's always talked about here, about knowing, can we ever know what it is to be a bat? And Nagel said, of course we can't. All we can ever do is imagine what it is like to have our own mind, if you like, inside the mind of a bat. And, we can sort of imagine what it might be like to use echolocation to find our way around. We might even these days use virtual reality to kind of simulate what that might mean and so on. But we're still doing that from our own experience. We cannot know what the subjective experience of a bat is. Now, Nagel was using that as a way of suggesting that consciousness itself can't be understood from a purely physicalist, materialist point of view, that there must be something more to it. And that's debated and discussed and critiqued by other philosophers of mind and other neuroscientists. But the basic notion of that impossibility of projecting ourselves into another, and particularly into a non-human mind, I think that absolutely holds. I think what starts to really become interesting these days, as neuroscience progresses and as AI progresses, is we can start to explore the extent to which we really are limited that way. The fact that we have brain machine interfaces opens up the possibility of being able, in some sense, to have direct communication between the mental, the neurological processes of ourselves and of other people, perhaps, hooking two people up so that they can do that. And in fact, there are some cases of conjoined twins where, there seems to be an experience of that one twin might experience some of the emotions that the other is experiencing because they share some parts of the same body. So it's not clear whether ultimately there is this necessary absolute separation between minds, or whether that we might find ways of them being able to communicate and being able to feel and perhaps even to think things that someone else is thinking. That's science fiction at the moment, but the more we research progresses, the more we can really think about that as being a possibility. And I honestly don't know where that leads. It's a fascinating idea. So I don't think we're necessarily trapped in our own minds, indefinitely. But at this point, that's where we have to start the discussion from.
Mm-hmm. So earlier we talked about how the mind is not reducible to the brain itself, but how should we think about the possible minds of beings that lack a brain and even a nervous system, like plants? Do you think that there are good enough arguments to extend the notion of mindedness to creatures outside the animal kingdom?
Yeah, I do actually. I think that again, that is one of the values of this notion of a space of possible minds, that we can put things like plants in that space somewhere. And I don't think it is in the same position as a coffee cup, which is kind of probably at zero on all the axes. I mean, it may not be, but that's the default assumption. I think plants are somewhere else. There are aspects of mindedness that they will have. And, that is absolutely clear, that plants are responsive. They're sensitive to their environment to different degrees in different plants. Some plants show remarkably, environmentally sensitive behavior. Some plants show this capacity that is called habituation. Stimulus doesn't always necessarily the same behavior, because if that stimulus is repeatedly given to the plant, over time they habituate. They if you like, to put it anthropomorphically, they recognize that there is no need to respond to that stimulus, just as we tend to be able eventually to shut out a sort of background noise if it clearly isn't something we need to respond to. That's essentially what the plant is doing. Now, there's absolutely no reason that I can see to think that there's any sentience, there's any awareness involved in that process within a plant. Others think perhaps there is. It's nice to have that discussion, but it's absolutely an attribute of mindedness of some sort, and so it qualifies the plant to have some non-zero place in the space of possible minds. And I think that idea gets us away from what I think can be an unproductive discussion of arguing about whether this means plants have minds or not. I think, we can then have a more useful discussion about what cognitive attributes do plants have. And I think this idea of thinking in cognitive terms about the behavior of organisms is actually an essential one for thinking about what life is. And I think, there are people who argue that even bacteria need to be thought of in a cognitive way. And by that, I think is generally meant the idea that we get away from this stimulus response, push button activity, and think much more about how all organisms integrate the information that they receive. They filter it, they're selective about what they respond to, what they attend to, and they integrate it in order to generate some sort of response. That doesn't need to involve any kind of awareness, but nevertheless, it's cognitive language is a better way of talking about that sort of behavior than a kind of machine-like behavior. And I think that, for this reason, again, as with panpsychism, I welcome the idea of biopsychism, which is the idea that, whether or not a coffee cup has awareness, all living things do. all living things have some degree of sentience. I think, and we don't have definitions of what sentience means, so I am agnostic on that issue, and I'm also wary of it. But I do think that it's a valid discussion to have, and that thinking about it in terms of these different attributes of cognition within a space of possible minds is the most productive way of having the discussion.
So, from an evolutionary perspective, how do you think we should approach the emergence of mind? That is, so for example, sometimes people discuss when exactly did certain cognitive abilities in certain particular species arose, the kinds of evolutionary pressures that led to the evolution of those cognitive abilities, for example. But since you're proposing there a biopsychist approach to the mind and saying that mindedness is basically your, perhaps we should think of it as being a property of all living things, do you think it makes sense to think about any particular point in the evolution of life where mind might have arisen, or does that question not even make sense? Perhaps we shouldn't think that there's any particular point where it happened.
Well, I do think that it's more useful and in fact necessary to think of this being a gradual process.
Okay.
As I say, I think that there is an argument that I'm sympathetic to, that all life can perhaps be best understood from a cognitive point of view.
Okay.
So, I certainly don't think it's useful to think there is some evolutionary threshold at which mind appeared. But having said that, that doesn't mean we have to think of it as just a purely sort of gradual, linear process of an increase in all these different attributes of mind until we get to us at the pinnacle. I think that we know that there are evolutionary transitions that are quite abrupt, and there are certain evolutionary innovations that really make a big difference to some organisms, and I think that that's absolutely the case with mind. So the appearance of nervous systems, was clearly a crucial aspect of the development of mindedness. It meant, so one thing that nerves do is allow, and in fact perhaps the key thing it does is allow long distance communication between different points in an organism, so that you can quickly signal, so that some sensory part of the organism can quickly signal to some other part, some perhaps information processing part or something, that it allows for new kinds of behavior. But I think that, even there, it's important to recognize that electrical signaling is something that we see all over the place, perhaps everywhere really in the living world, that there's electrical signaling in plants, even though they don't have neurons. So before, but it was a very significant a very significant extension or complexification of that idea of electrical signaling to allow that rapidly to happen over long distances. And one idea of what happened with the development of nervous systems is that there were maybe two sort of aspects of mind, one to do with movement and one to do with information processing, and perhaps those were sort of separate things that at some point nervous systems allowed to be integrated into a whole. And I think that one of the interesting ways which diverged from us, from vertebrates and ultimately mammals and all the rest of it, about 600 million years ago, long ago, when our shared evolutionary ancestor seems to be a very primitive organism, a kind of flatworm with a nervous system that's very primitive. So before there was any notion of a brain, let alone a sort of mind in the sense that we often think about it, and so in a sense octopuses are a separate evolutionary experiment in the development of minds, and they have a very different anatomy to our own. The nervous system is much more distributed. There are clusters of nerves in the arms of octopuses that seem to have a degree of autonomy. But the octopus also has a centralized brain, and it's not clear. And it seems to be that the arms can, to some extent, make their own decisions, if you like. And that one perspective that's been put forward by the philosopher Peter Godfrey-Smith is that possibly sometimes the octopus's mind, if you like, is watching its limbs do things without having any say about it, almost as though it's watching another organism do things. And then at other times the mind, if you like, pulls the whole system together, because these nervous systems are connected, and the central brain takes command and makes the whole body do things. So it's been suggested that octopuses don't necessarily have a unified experience, that maybe it's more disparate. It's as though there are several kinds of mind-like entities within a single organism that are sometimes working together and sometimes not. It's a totally different view of mind from our own that evolution has also come up with. And I think it's very valuable that we have at least that one other example of the way that mindedness can be developed and can give rise, in the case of octopuses in particular, to very complex behavior that we can't always interpret, or often can't interpret in terms of what it's about, but it's clearly complex behavior in a way that is anatomically and behaviorally and probably cognitively very different from our own. So yeah, I think that also within an evolutionary perspective, it's important to recognize that there is probably more than one way to build mindedness.
And how about artificial intelligence? Do you think that there's any way of figuring out if a particular artificially intelligent system has a mind, or is sentient or conscious?
Well, again, at the moment, we don't really have agreed foolproof ways of doing that for other living organisms. And in fact, it's still a subject under discussion of how we identify, or if we can identify, consciousness within humans, within people who might be comatose in a vegetative state. It's very difficult to figure out if there is still some sort of consciousness there. There are techniques being developed that seem to perhaps be able to get at that, but no one knows for sure. So how we do that for a totally artificial, basically a machine that we have made, we really don't know. And I think that it's made even more complex by the fact that we don't know, in that case, what we're looking for. We have some idea, so at least some subjective idea with humans, about what we're looking for in consciousness, because it's what we experience. But as I said earlier, I don't think there is any reason to suppose that if consciousness were to develop in AI, it would be like ours, it would manifest in ways that were like ours. And in fact, I think at the moment, there are good reasons to suppose that it really wouldn't be like that. So we don't know what consciousness would even mean in AI. It's a very open question, an exciting one, sometimes a sort of perhaps a slightly scary one. But I think it has to be, that discussion has to happen, first of all, within the context of being clear that most people working in that field of AI and computer science feel there is no reason to suppose at the moment that any AI that we have developed has consciousness, in the way that we would understand it. And the tests that we have to look for that are not good tests on the whole, because they tend to be tests that are predicated on the idea that we'll get behavioral responses from the AI that are like humans. But we know that AI is becoming incredibly good, particularly with large language models, becoming incredibly good at mimicking human behavior without there being any real understanding Now there's a discussion that's going on now about whether there is some kind of understanding in there, but at the moment it's not difficult with a lot of these, even the most sophisticated systems, to find ways of showing that they do absurd things that a 3 or 4 year old child wouldn't do in terms of generalizing behavior and understanding the world. So I don't think there's any really good argument that AI at the moment has human-like understanding, and I don't take it for granted that as it develops, that is somehow magically going to appear just because the AI gets bigger and more complex. I think it's more likely, and there are computer scientists who think it's more likely, that we are going to be forced to broaden the way we think about understanding and consciousness and mindedness, because we are developing new kinds of system that actually aren't like ours. We're training them often on human input, but there is no reason to suppose that they're going to process them and perhaps ultimately to experience them in the way that we do.
And do you think that it might be useful or informative to try to imagine the minds of possible aliens? And if so, why?
Yeah, well, I certainly think it's a fun thing to do. I think it's also perhaps a useful or necessary thing to do if we are interested, as some scientists are, in looking for signs of extraterrestrial intelligence. I mean, we're looking for signs of life elsewhere on other planets, and often that's done by, now that we can look at the chemistry of the atmospheres of planets around other stars, exoplanets as they're often called, we can analyze that chemistry for signs that are suggestive of there being some sort of life that's affecting the atmosphere, just as life on Earth, dominates really the nature of our own atmosphere. But looking for intelligence is another matter, and people look for perhaps radio signals or broadcasts from other planets that might show signs of intelligence. And popular way has been to look for signals with some kind of pattern that it would be hard to attribute to any natural process. For example, some way of encoding all the digits of pi, because that's the mathematical notion, the ratio of the circumference to the diameter of a circle, because the argument is that there's no obvious way that a natural process would create a signal like that, but probably any intelligence in the universe is going to come across the notion of pi, because it's a geometric thing that is going to be the same on any planet. And they might think, well, if we're trying to broadcast ourselves elsewhere, maybe this is something that other beings would recognize. I think that a lot of, and this is a critique that some astronomers have made, that that thinking so often is anthropocentric. It comes back to what we would do in that situation if we were like us, but just had perhaps better technology, or even our existing technology. And I think thinking about the space of possible minds, and thinking, as I said earlier, about the different evolutionary directions that mindedness could go, should make us skeptical about that idea. You could say, and I think reasonably say, well, we have to start somewhere. If we assume that other minds are like ours, then we can at least figure out what to look for. If they're very different to ours, what do we even do? And I think there's now a very creative discussion going on about whether mindedness has to be the way it is, whether there's a kind of, if all life everywhere on Earth is it evolves along Darwinian lines, perhaps there are commonalities that all biology and all complex beings will show. Perhaps they will be driven by similar imperatives of survival and reproduction and so on. And I think that's a good discussion to have, and there are good arguments, in favour of that notion. But I do think that we have to be wary of doing that too much, because we know that that there are other ways that mindedness can evolve. So I think that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, I think it would benefit from taking a very broad view of what mindedness might be like.
So I have one final question then. What is your take on free will, and why do you think free will matters when it comes to understanding the mind?
I think it's interesting. Free will has it's come back into fashion, you could say. Although some philosophers of mind, some neuroscientists throw up their arms and they throw up their hands. They're fed up with this discussion. They don't think it will get anywhere. But I think that actually there's quite a rich discussion about free will going on just at the moment, particularly because there are two books that have come out very recently: Free Agents by the neuroscientist Kevin Mitchell, and Determined by the cognitive and behavioral scientist Robert Sapolsky, that come to completely different conclusions about whether there is free will or not. So Kevin is in favour, says there is a meaningful notion of free will, and Sapolsky really doesn't think so. He thinks we have no free will whatsoever. I have to say, on Kevin Mitchell's side, but I think that the reason I am is that we need to think about what minds are for and what they do, and ultimately minds are they are formers of meaning. They help. That minds are there to make sense of our environment, to decide, if you like, what is meaningful in the environment and what isn't, what we need to respond to and what we don't, and they. For that reason, they become causal agents, autonomous causal agents. They make things happen, and in a way that we have to attribute to the mind itself. And I think that what Robert Sapolsky is, ultimately all the causation can be sort of it sort of filters all from the bottom up. So, ultimately we're all particles, we're all atoms interacting, and there's nothing that the mind can do about that. It can't alter the interaction between an electron and an atom. So how can free will come into this if that's all we are? And, the next higher levels up, there are neurons firing at each other. He says, show me the neuron that is responsible for free will. How does a neuron decide of its own accord whether to fire or not? And I think that that's the wrong way to think about what minds are. That minds are there to be primary causal agents. They integrate all this behavior, and then they integrate all this information, including experience, including things that are innate, and then they decide on a particular course of action. And there are good. This is not just a sort of hand waving argument. There are good mathematical reasons to think that they therefore show a kind of causal emergence, that the causation in minded systems happens mostly at the higher level, at the cognitive level, rather than down at the level of neurons, and certainly by the level of atoms and molecules. There is no real, there's no real causation that you can use to explain what we see. So, it makes no sense to say that this coffee cup is here because my atoms brought it here. Even though there's a way you can talk about that. The reason my coffee cup is here is because I wanted a cup of coffee before I did this interview. That is the primary causal action there. And once we take that point of view about minds, then I think there is a meaningful notion of free will that is completely compatible with a belief in a materialistic basis, that that we don't have to posit magical entities that are somehow intervening in the interactions of atoms or molecules. You absolutely don't need to have that at all. It's completely consistent with a sort of positivistic, really a materialistic idea of how things work, but it's simply recognizing that the minds are causal agents, and are necessarily causal agents in the world. That is what they are for. That is why they evolved. And if to my mind, if I can think I am the causal agent of some of the things that I do, of course it's influenced by my history, of course it's influenced by what I'm getting from my environment, but that's simply saying what minds are. They take in all that information and they come, they integrate it and come to some decision. And for that reason, they can be thought of as causal agents. And if that, if my mind is doing that, to me, that seems a perfectly satisfying notion of free will. I am determining in some meaningful sense what happens to me.
Great. So the book is again the book of minds, how to understand ourselves and other beings, from animals to AI to aliens. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Ball, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, yes, happily. I have a website on the internet. It's very simple, easy to remember, www.philipball.co.uk. And details of all my books are there. So that's probably the best place to look. You can find me on Twitter. Philip C. letter C. Ball is my Twitter handle. And hopefully at least some of the books are in good bookshops. So hopefully you can find them quite easily.
Great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's been a pleasure for me too.
To aliens, I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Ball, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, yes, happily. I have a website on the internet. It's very simple, easy to remember, www.philipball.co.uk. And details of all my books are there. So that's probably the best place to look. You can find me on Twitter. Philip C. letter C. Ball is my Twitter handle. And hopefully at least some of the books are in good bookshops. So hopefully you can find them quite easily.
Great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's been a pleasure for me too.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbourd, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Errington, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernardini, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets and Rosie. Thank you for all.